Hello, I'm Vinita Shetty and speaking from the offices of the Smart Citizen in Barcelona, Spain. And I'm speaking to Niren Jain, environmental planner, architect, and landscape architect. And he's based in Dakshin Kannada in South India. And he's here to share his thoughts in the context of current pandemic and the symbiotic relationship between the wilderness and the city. So, whether it originated in a lab or a wild wet market in Wuhan, at the root of this COVID 19 pandemic is the fact that human population is pushing into ecosystems that have been undisturbed for so long. Destruction of biodiversity is increasing the risk of human infections of animal origins. And that's thrown into sharp relief the visible connections between human beings and other living beings and whole ecospheres. We often think of COVID as having originated and this pandemic having originated from China, but there's no absolute geography because actually it's one of the discoveries people are making is it's a matter of relative geographies and could very well originate in India. Niren, you were famously involved in walking and mapping 600 miles of the Kudremukh National Park. We can see that in the background to expose the damage caused by mining companies in the fragile rainforests along the southwest coast of India. You've also been involved in educating the local community of their resettlement rights. So, can you talk us through this connection between human health and ecosystem health in the context of your personal experience?
Yeah, hi Vinita, thanks for getting me on this interview. So I've been, so there's two lines of thought in wildlife and forest conservation. One is the land sparing approach, where you keep your hands off certain areas of high value and you try to live in the other parts, letting aside a large chunk for wildlife and forests. See, the other one is a land sharing approach where you try and live in harmony. That will work in large areas of forests of Africa or the Amazon, where the densities of people living there is very low, and that's an approach you can take there. But in a very high population density of humans, like in India, that would be very difficult, at least in fragile ecosystems like the Western Ghats. And at the same time, when you're trying to conserve large mammal species. So we've been advocating land sparing approach for conservation here. I'm not, I mean, and it's not universally applicable to all geographies, like you said. It needs to be kind of looked at specifically on certain aspects, the ecosystem, the pressures, and all that. So we've been advocating the land sparing approach for Kudremukh National Park and the rest of the areas here in Western Ghats. So one of the key things we did was try to the people living deep inside the forest, like the one that you see in the backdrop there. These are all very isolated settlements. They need to walk for at least 7 to 10 kilometers to reach the closest public transport. So when we were interacting with them, they said they had to carry their agricultural produce first to approach road and then carry it to the market, which was further away. And they said it was no longer feasible to live there because none of their children were there. They were all outside in the hostel studying somewhere else. And culture and their aspirations have changed. They all wanted to get better employment opportunities elsewhere, so their children also wouldn't come back and live there. So we said, we kind of demonstrated that to find an alternative land, agricultural land, just outside of these forests. So quite a few of them have now taken that approach, and I'm not telling them to shift it to large metros or very high urban areas. They just shifted out to the outside the forest where all the basic amenities are available to them. So in that way, the emerging infectious diseases, which as per research by Murray et al. Has revealed that it kind of is a there is a high probability for emerging infectious diseases to kind of have an outbreak. One in tropical forests, the second, the large mammal species, being a very high density of large mammals in these forests. So if you look at even more than China, I would say India has far more higher probability of outbreak risk. So I think we need to be even more careful, and especially when we are trying to deal with people directly interacting or consuming wild meats. So it's fine for indigenous people or the people living in the forest to consume that for the protein requirement. That as per what is being advocated by human rights, even though we don't advocate that approach. But it goes beyond that in the sense it's not just for their consumption. It is basically being sent to the local markets. From there, it goes elsewhere. Though legally in India you can't trade in wild meats, but illegally a lot of things has been happening because our forests are still reachable to a huge population. You can easily access them and quickly get out meat and transfer it to urban areas. That's been one of the biggest concerns. And how does this happen? It all happens through a lot of road networks getting in. Even currently, the Amkola Hubli Railway is being planned. There's the Shishila Bhairapura Road, which is in our own landscape, which is being planned, which right now it's got a stay order from the High Court and it's been stalled temporarily. But the intrusions of road to these remote areas has been continuously happening in spite of all such threats. And now the we can see through the pandemic, because the pandemic was never in our advocacy. We were always telling it is a forest, it's a wildlife for the sake of wildlife, for the sake of environment. Now it's the human health issues itself which is kind of coming out very clearly. And I think it's high time when even wildlife conservationists join hands and advocated along with emerging infectious disease researchers in terms of the threat, how we need to kind of preferably keep our hands off these forests, and it's both good for the environment as well as for human health.
I see. Okay, so hopefully that message is sinking in. I think human interaction with the wilderness is positive and beneficial. If we can't go into the wilderness, is there a way of bringing the wilderness to us, into the cities? Do you have any thoughts of that as a landscape planner or as an environmental planner?
In urban areas, I would say, I mean, again, the definition of a wilderness itself is, in a sense, you need to kind of keep it quite hands off and on its own. So in urban areas, you might find some smaller wilderness because of unmaintained lands. And that's fast coming back in our region because a lot of agricultural properties and other lands are not being able to be cleared because of shortage of labor. So even in urban areas, there's a lot of bush, a lot of cover for wildlife where it can move around within the urban areas. And we see, myself, I'm seeing quite a bit of wildlife around my house because a lot of bush is available for them to move around now. So we can kind of think about green areas for urban setting, but I don't think it's really a target area for maintaining wildlife or large forests. So these two are definitely two separate things, at least as far as how I see things, at least in our landscape. So yeah.
I see. So architects are problem solvers, and I'm just wondering if you can sort of have a crystal ball in front of you. How do you think things are, going to get back to normal? How do we get our vibrant cities back? Public spaces. There's such a trauma of public spaces now because it used to be the trusted space, and now you're afraid to go out. Our markets, our maidans, when do they get back to normal?
Yeah, it's being said that no, we're not going back to normal because normal was the problem. I think that's a very interesting anonymous quote I read somewhere.
Mm.
I think it's time. It's a great opportunity to do large structural changes in terms of how we live and how we've designed our public spaces and especially from what I see, I'm sure it's quite common, and that's only norm in the West of having large supermarket, air-conditioned supermarkets. Whereas India, till recently, at least in Mangalore, we've always had small neighborhood stores, mom and pop stores, and the large supermarkets are more recent phenomena, which has completely taken away the business from the neighborhood mom and pop stores. So I see a huge revival of these small neighborhood stores, which I feel is a better model than having large supermarkets. So my neighborhood shop, that person is telling you he's had almost fourfold increase in his business after the pandemic. So that I feel is a great positive sign of having smaller shops close by. You don't have to commute too far. You can probably walk or cycle. Environmentally, also that is far better. And this whole thing about enclosing the building without any windows and completely keeping central air conditioning in such buildings, where you could actually, you don't really need that. It's just we're just imitating what's being done in the West or elsewhere, and not really probably adapting to what our climate or our culture is. Uh, so I hope that even such public buildings in the mall culture will gradually change to more open air, more passive cooled, non-air conditioned spaces. I'm sure that is a great positive, both environmentally, both for climate change, as well as how operating costs of these shops also.
Yeah. So that's interesting. It seems like there'll be it's just prompted a rethink about maybe about a return to the vernacular in terms of architecture.
Yeah, I think we have a lot to learn in terms of what materials was being used in vernacular architecture. And presently, everybody's forgotten them, or even the techniques are forgotten. So I'm hoping that this pandemic will change those things to adapt to more vernacular elements. I don't think we're going back to vernacular architecture when we're doing a new building, but I'm sure we have a lot to take from the vernacular elements that work very well for our climate in the region. So, and especially in terms of your planning around the courtyard or good cross ventilation, having non-air conditioned space. As I was mentioning to someone, we're just putting a suit and a boot and a tie, and then we want the AC full on. Traditionally, that was never the case. We were just wearing light
Mm.
cotton clothes, and which is so much more healthier and which was apt for our climate. And which basically clothing is what keeps somebody very comfortable in their natural environments. That's very important. The type of clothing is very important.
Mhm. How about housing? That's also a domain that you're particularly involved in. And do you see any changes in the way housing is conceived and built?
Yeah, so I hear from my friends who've been living in multi-dwelling residential multi-storied apartments that the conflict during the pandemic in terms of what decision has to be taken, whether domestic help can be allowed into the building or not, whether people can go out, whether children can play. These are all very, very individual decisions uh, at such times. But when somebody is imposing it, probably even stricter than what the government has imposed on us, which is supposed the government itself had supposed to have imposed one of the most strictest measures
Mm.
of lockdown in the world. So if the associations are even more stricter than that, you can imagine the kind of debate and uneasiness the residents are going through. So I hear that a lot of people would actually prefer individual houses on a plot, more plotted development rather than a multi-story, multi-dwelling units. of residences. That we could see some change in that as well, I guess.
Now, one of the sort of counter narratives to this success story of containment and mitigation of the COVID-19 disease that's certainly running through in India is the starvation of the migrant workers. And our usual food supply chains have broken down, and there's speculation of a global reset in the way food is produced and distributed. And the PM has advised self-reliance. Wondered how this would play out in the scenario of food systems and localizing the food systems for easier distribution.
Yeah, I think regional food security is one aspect which government or the public never bothered much till now, because they always felt there is a free flow or a good supply chain of food supplies into our region. But we could really see during the lockdown what was the scarcity like and how bad it was. The Tudunadu, our district of Tudunadu, was one of the most productive during ancient times, where three crops of paddy could have been harvested during 1 year, and that's very rare in the entire South India. It's only the west coast where you could harvest three crops of paddy in a year. So it was such a productive land, but today it's just been neglected. The paddy fields that you see in the backdrop are one of the very, very few of them that is left out. And that too, it's everybody's telling that it's no longer sustainable to have these food crops because it's very labor intensive. So they've all shifted to betel nut or the chewing nut, the areca nut plantations and the rubber plantations. It's a rarity that you would see such paddy. At the same time, the paddy could be grown only in low-lying wetlands. So sadly, in Karnataka, we don't have a policy that conserve these low-lying wetlands, which offer such great food security. At the same time, our immediately neighboring states of Kerala and Goa have a legislation in place not to have any development over these low-lying wetlands. Whether they're growing paddy or it's been abandoned for several decades, you cannot do a building or do a landfill in such sites. Whereas if you look at the backdrop here, buildings are continuously coming up. And that's also causing a whole lot of other problems of flooding because those are the main drainages, and the water needs to come over these paddy fields very often and then drain out slowly. And that's what is choking in these urban areas. Even though it's a highly undulating terrain with very few wetlands like this, we're just choking with such development. I'm hoping the regional or local food security will kind of bring this aspect of regional food security also some good policies on them, and I'm hoping these wetlands also will be preserved. And I think the urban farming or the farming in the terrace also, which there is hardly anybody has taken up those. Maybe just a handful of enthusiasts have tried it. I guess that people will be more enthusiastic to try the urban farming concept also in the future.
Finally, I'd like to get to a favorite or like a pet theme of yours, which is urban cycling. And you're living close to a city which has very little bicycle riding, possibly because of the weather. And we're seeing a great move now towards bicycles and walking as cars are discouraged. And people, cities, some of the more progressive cities like Bangalore are capturing the day by encouraging public bicycling. Now, tell us about your vision of what's possible in a small town like in a small city like Mangalore, because you had a very novel idea, which
I'm not sure if people have stopped cycling because of the climate or the weather here. I think it's more because of we don't have a safe lane or a safe cycling routes. that we take our children to school safely, like how we used to do when we were young, with very little traffic. Or even I myself I'm very skeptical about venturing out in a cycle on the main roads because there's no dedicated lane. Even if there was a dedicated lane, I'm not sure if I would move in them because it gets so because it's so wide and people can easily the traffic can easily run you over. So I was trying to find a way to commute across the city. So I was thinking, what's a safe way to do it? So close to my house and most of Mangalore has these small lanes, what we call as Oni in Tulu, which are just basically right of ways of not more than 6 foot where no motorized traffic can go. Forget the four wheelers. Two-wheelers also cannot move in most of them. This has basically been pedestrian right of ways before the cars became the norm of commute. So these have been there, lying there traditionally, and everybody just kind of neglects these spaces, and they just say it's inconvenient. So I wasn't sure initially how many of these would be networking around our city. So I started to explore and map informally all such lanes that was around me, so that I can see where I can which is the destinations I can go through, almost following in these narrow lanes or narrow lanes. So in the process, I almost took almost 2 to 3 years to kind of come up with some ideas in terms of formulate my ideas in terms of how practically this can be taken forward. So you have quite a long stretches of these ponies, which will go into a small residential lane, which is again less than 4 meters, 5 meters, where a car can go, but it can't speed. These are all traffic count streets where public are using it very well. So I think so. If we are able to connect the Onis and the small, narrow, winding residential streets where across the city, it's very practical to kind of come up with a good plan to clearly establish a network of such lanes all across the city. And the advantage is the Mangalore city itself, between the two rivers of Gurupura and Netravati, or Gurupura on the north and the Netravati on the south. The entire stretch is just 10 kilometers as a crow flies, which is perfect distance for making cycling practical enough. So in terms of the size of the city, we are at that perfect niche. And there are a whole lot of other advantages also that Mangalore as a city has, which I won't go into now because it'll be too lengthy. So I started mapping all these small lanes that runs through, and these are all quite. The surfacing is not an issue, so we don't have to spend anything on them. It's just probably some signages, and mainly also to kind of put maps and provide markings in yellow or different colored markings to show where these lanes can lead to. Otherwise, one can get lost. During the mapping exercise, we realized that it is not so easy for a first timer to, or even if you travel on it several times, you can get lost so easily. So unless there is a clear signage and directions, you can't really move in there. That's why it's not got popular at all. So in terms of cost, it's at one of the most minimal costs because you just need to put the signage. In terms of interventions, it's just very small interventions because some of the broken linkages just needs to be connected through probably a bridge across a small drain or cutting across a small property, and you just need 6 feet width, so you can just cut across. So and this was taken very positively, and we're hoping that we'll come up with something quite effective for Bangalore very soon.
That's great.
And sorry, I forgot to add. So all this I was doing before the pandemic. Now, after the pandemic, especially public transport, crowded transport is a huge issue. They've not yet started. They've not yet opened public transport, and there's There's a big population of people commuting to work on public transport. There's school children going in public transport. And even if they revive it, I'm not sure how it's going to be operated, maybe only 50%. If you're operating at 50%, the cost is going to be much higher. It was already quite high, and it's going to be even higher once the public transport opens. So the bicycle transport is a great option as long as we design it well. Mangalore is a highly undulating terrain. We are trying to see how we can keep the gradient even and plan out in such a route that we don't have to go too much uphill and downhill, unnecessarily exhausting ourselves. So yeah, this has been one of my pet projects that I've been working on for quite some time.
That's great. I hope this passion project becomes a reality soon. We're actually very grateful to Niren because he's going to be leading tour of Moodabidri. That's the place in the background. It's a complex of Jain temples, and in fact, it's the largest concentration of granite buildings of worship in half a kilometer radius anywhere in the world. So it's a very special place and a candidate for heritage conservation because there's no formal heritage status given to it yet, except for one or two of the monuments. And Niren is the first to have done a timeline of construction of the various buildings in this complex. This will be part of it, actually, the inaugural activity of Placemaking Week India 2020, which will be held December 2nd to 6th in and around Mangaluru. So we look forward to your participation there. And I'd like to thank Niren again. I hope your passion project comes true, and we'll be extending all our support through this event. The bicycling project is perfect for World Bicycle Day, which is June 3rd. And we look forward to working with you in the months ahead to make Placemaking India Week a success. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vinita, for having me in this interview. Thank you. See you soon.